Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to show you how to set up your clutch pedal properly for sim racing. Now I thought I'd do this video because there's probably a lot of you out there that maybe don't drive in real life. Maybe you're a younger sim racer and you haven't yet got your license, or perhaps you are from the States where a lot of you drive, or mostly drive automatic, so perhaps you haven't driven a stick before, as you guys like to call it over there. So you might not know how a clutch operates or how best to set your pedal up in sim racing for it to work as it should do, like a real clutch pedal in a real car. Now, there are lots of different types of clutch in the real world, so you can't set it up to work like all of them. So this is going to be I'm going to explain how most clutches work. You can get different. No, I was about to get complicated. I won't get complicated. Let's just say there are many different types of clutch in many different cars. This is how the simplest clutch works, and you'll find it in the most common cars, your average sort of daily driver, rather than a high performance car. So first of all, when it comes to sim racing clutch pedals, we've got two different types. We've got linear pedals that feel the same from the moment you start to depress them all the way till you hit the stop at the end. And those would be a Logitech clutch pedal or a Thrustmaster clutch pedal. And then you've got the higher end stuff, like the Fanatec, the Untitled Sim, all these sort of more high end ones. And they have what's called, or what I'm going to call, a simulated biting point. Now the biting point, again, for those of you that don't know, is when the clutch just starts to engage your engine and gearbox together and the car would start to creep forward. If you were to then push the clutch pedal down just a touch, the car would stop and you'd be disengaged. And if you were to raise it up just a touch to that biting point, it just start to join the engine and gearbox. These are rotating, by the way. And the car would just start to creep forward. If you were to lift off completely, then the clutch would be fully engaged. And if you were idle, the car would stall. If you had your accelerator pedal down, you would obviously take off forwards. So a clutch, as you can tell from that brief description there, its job is to separate the engine from the gearbox. Your engine is always rotating when it's running like this. And on the end of your crankshaft is a flywheel. It's the flywheel that your clutch mechanism is bolted to. Now this flywheel rotates at whatever your engine RPM is. So 1,000 RPM would be 1,000 revolutions per minute. 10,000 RPM, it would be rotating 10,000 times a minute. So really, really fucking fast. And then the gearbox comes in from the side or from the back, depending which way your engine's rotated in the particular car. And it marries up to the engine and covers up this flywheel. Your clutch is bolted to the flywheel, and there is a shaft that comes out of the gearbox into the clutch mechanism. This is called an input shaft, and that engages with the center of the clutch. Now, when the clutch is fully engaged, the engine's rotating at whatever RPM it is, and so now your input shaft that's coming from the gearbox will also be rotating at that same RPM. And then obviously it goes through the gearbox, whatever gear you happen to be in, out your drive shafts and to your wheels on your car, and that's what makes you move. So again, the clutch's job, and I might be telling people who already know what it is, but for those of you that don't, the clutch's job is simply to disengage the engine and the gearbox. So the engine can sit there idling, or you can sit there and rev it freely, and the car isn't zooming off down the road if you were in gear. If you're in neutral and the clutch and your foot's off the clutch, the engine and gearbox are engaged, they are together as one, the input shaft is spinning, the flywheel is spinning, but because the gearbox is in neutral, the car obviously doesn't go anywhere. If you were to then put it in a gear, the car would obviously move. Now the reason you have to put the clutch down before you go from neutral to a gear is that when the engine's running and the clutch is engaged and your input shaft is spinning, there is a big shaft literally in the gearbox called the input shaft. That'll be rotating the whole time. If you try and then put it in first, for example, with that rotating, there's cogs that need to mesh together. If the cogs on your input shaft are spinning like mad, and you try and engage first, they're just gonna grind against it, which is why you get that grinding sound. So you depress the clutch, the input shaft comes to a halt or almost to a halt, and then the teeth can engage together, so you're in gear. Then you would bring the clutch pedal up, allowing the engine and gearbox to engage together as one, and the car would gradually pull away. Now, the reason you bring the clutch up slowly is because if you just dump the clutch and your revs are too low, the engine would stall, because the wheels of your car need to have time to gradually get moving. So that's why you bring your clutch up very slowly, and the two just start to touch together. And as they start to touch, flywheel spinning round, gearbox side obviously isn't. As it just starts to touch, make a little bit of friction, the gearbox side will slowly start to turn and the car will slowly start to move until you get up to a speed where they're spinning together as one. I hope that was reasonably clear. Now, that biting point I referenced earlier is where the two come together, and it's literally just starting to touch, just starting to make a little bit of friction and get a little bit of grip, just starting to bite, hence biting point. Now, I'm going to start some screen capture and show you the parts of a clutch here in this picture. Hopefully it's a reasonably clear picture. Where's my mouse cursor gone? Here it is. So you can see where I'm illustrating with the mouse cursor here on the left. This is the flywheel that I was referencing that's spinning round. And then this shaft, you can just make out in the middle here and just there, that runs through the middle. That is your input shaft. In fact, if you look in this left-hand half of the picture, you can see it here even clearer. They call it a lay shaft, input shaft, lay shaft, same thing. And it goes into the gearbox. And you can see, in fact, you can see in this left-hand diagram, the whole assembly put together. But let's just look over the other side for a second and show you the individual parts. Again, if you know how clutch works, you can skip further into this to the pedal setup part of the video. But if you don't, it's good to get an understanding of how a clutch works, and then you'll understand why we're setting the pedal up, how we're setting it up. So there's your flywheel, that's spinning at whatever RPM your engine is. Then you've got this plate in the middle here. They've just called it a clutch plate in this diagram. I call it a friction plate. Well, not me, but it is also called a friction plate. And this is the bit that actually bites and grips between the flywheel and the gearbox side. So this area here that's separated by this little line, there's a few of these pads on here. They're almost like brake pads on a car, similar sort of material. And they work in a similar way. They bite into this big steel disc that we call the flywheel. So anyway, you've then got your pressure plate. If you look here with the mouse, the pressure plate pushes on the back of the friction plate. It pushes it hard against the flywheel. Now, what causes the pressure from the pressure plate is these diaphragm springs on this very last section here. You see they're individual fingers, some people call them, because they're long and thin. And the very edges of these fingers, or diaphragm springs as they actually are, push against the very edge of the pressure plate, which then pushes against the friction plate, hard up against the flywheel. This is if your foot was off of the clutch and the clutch was fully engaged. So those springs are then encased in the clutch cover, which if you look on the left-hand diagram, there's done a cutaway, but you can see the back half of it. That will cover up, you can see the fingers, the springs there again. That will cover them up. And these little, what look like dowels poking out, same on this side, are called spring pivots. They slot into recesses in the clutch cover, and that is where the springs actually pivot. Now, if we look over again to the right-hand diagram, throw-out bearing, release bearing, thrust bearing, called all of those things. You can see it's quite a bit smaller in diameter than the rest of the clutch. And if you look closely, just in the center of the fingers or the diaphragm springs, they bend up at the ends and they sit just inside the end of this release bearing. So release bearing sits over the end of the springs there. When you press the clutch pedal down, what you're actually doing is pushing this bearing into the middle of these springs here. You're pushing it until the bearing literally pushes against springs and then moves the springs inward, and they pivot where these little dowel looking type things are. So by you pushing in the middle there, let's say bottom of my hand is the middle, by you pushing and the top of my hand is the edge of the springs where it would push on the pressure plate, your release bearing pushes in the bottom here, they pivot here because that's where those little dowels are, and so the very top of the springs have now pulled away from the pressure plate. At that moment, your friction plate is no longer being pushed hard against the flywheel and your clutch is disengaged. Your engine is spinning freely and your gearbox is doing nothing. Your input shaft slots into the middle of the friction plate. It's got splines like teeth. So when the friction plate isn't spinning, the gearbox isn't spinning. So again, here's one of those springs, here's your release bearing, pushes in the bottom, the top naturally pulls away from your friction plate, which should be here, and so the friction plate stops turning, the input shaft stops turning. You can put your gearbox in gear, no problem at all, and then as you bring your foot back off the clutch, those springs start to go back to their upright position or their fully engaged position, and the top of them is again pushing hard against the pressure plate, against the friction plate, and then right up in turn against that flywheel, fully engaged. Now, the biting point is, as I mentioned earlier, when this friction plate just starts to grip against the flywheel. So it's when the springs are applying just enough pressure for the material on the friction plate to start biting against the flywheel. And then turn, the friction plate will then gradually start to rotate the input shaft. If you're in gear, your wheels will start to turn on your car. I know this sounds like a long-winded explanation. If you know what it is already, you know how it works, I'll say skip through. But for those of you that don't, hopefully you find this helpful. So that is how a clutch works. Now, those springs that we're talking about here, these diaphragm springs, they have a certain amount of pressure that you feel through your pedal. You know, you're using leverage to bring them away from the friction plate. Now, the leverage point, the fulcrum, is here where those little spring pivots or dowels are, and you're applying force here. When you fully overcome the strength of the spring, the pedal goes lighter, the clutch pedal this is. So as you're pushing that pedal down, it starts off in an engaged position. You get to a certain point and the pedal goes, oh, light. That's because your leverage has now fully overcome the strength of the spring and you're fully disengaged. Now this is where we're going to start talking about how you set the pedal up, because Fanatec pedals and some of the others I mentioned, the more high-end ones, have a simulated biting point, and that works by, as you press the clutch pedal down, you'll feel it's heavy, oh, and then it goes light. And if you bring it up a little bit, you'll feel the weight just start to increase, and that is literally simulating this. You're fully disengaged, the pedal's as light as it can be. As you bring it back up and the spring pressure starts to sort of more overcome your leverage, you feel that pressure increase, just like you would in real life. Really nice little touch as far as simulation goes. Now, that is your biting point. In our simulators, in our games that we play, you can set the biting point in the game by adjusting the clutch pedal saturation, because at the point just after the biting point, on the way down, when you're disengaging, you can then change gear. So the pedal will go down and down and down, and it will just go light. And you can, like I say, you can bring it up a little bit and you'll feel it go heavier, push it down a tiny bit and you'll feel it go lighter again. That's when you fully overcome the springs. At that moment, the clutch is disengaged. That friction plate that you see here is disengaged from the flywheel. You will now be able to change gear. The pedal will still travel maybe another inch or so, or actually it massively varies from car to car. Some cars have a biting point that's just off the floor, other cars the biting point is almost at the top of the pedal travel, so that varies massively. That's not adjustable in our sims, as in our physical components. The Fanatec ones, they have a you simulate a biting point where they put it, and the same on the other pedals as well. So what you need to do is set your clutch saturation in the game to where that biting point is physically on your pedals. When you go down and you feel it go light, just back up a touch to where it just starts to go heavy again. That's the biting point. That is where you should set your saturation point to in your sim. So whether that be 40% travel, 60% travel, 50% travel, wherever that is, round about that area, that's where you set your saturation point, or just after, you know. Let's say you move it 50% and it goes light, you move it back 10% and it's heavy, about 45%, you're going to be just past the biting point. That would be where you want to set your saturation point. So that in game, you're able to change gear just like you would in a real car once you've gone past the biting point and the clutch is disengaged. In a real car, you do not need to press the clutch pedal all the way to the floor to be able to change gear. It's just once you get past the biting point, just once you've overcome those springs and they've disengaged. Now, of course, you do press the pedal all the way to the floor because we all change gear, you know, in a swift motion. No one goes, oh, I'm past 45% or I'm past the biting point, I can change gear. Now, we all stamp the pedal to the floor and change gear. And we do it simultaneously. We press the clutch pedal down and we move our stick at the same time. So, you know, it's not a conscious thing, you just do it. If, again, I've mentioned this in other videos, if you had to put the clutch all the way to the floor before you moved your stick, you'd end up crunching gears all the time because you do it at the same time. Press the pedal, move the stick, and your foot wouldn't have gone down. You'd physically have to go foot, then gear stick for it to work. You know, the reason we can do it at the same time is because our foot only has to travel beyond that biting point and we're able to change gear. So let's get out of this diagram and let's have a look at the Fanatec control panel here, because that's what I've got plugged in at the moment. If you look down here to the left where it says clutch, I'm just going to reach down here. This is the other thing, you shouldn't be able to push the clutch pedal down by hand like this. I'm using 2 fingers, which means that clutch pedal really is way too light compared to a clutch in a real car. I build engines and tune cars for a living. I fit performance clutches, I fit standard clutches. I can tell you this pedal is way too light. I don't even in something small like a Nissan Micra, I probably can't push the clutch pedal down with only 2 fingers. Well, maybe I could, but anyway, I think these are too light. But if you look at the gauge, sorry, as I'm pushing this pedal down, it goes light about here. Now, it'd be helpful if it actually gave us a percentage on this bar rather than just a bar, but we're going to have to do it, we're going to have to eyeball it. So it goes, yeah, it's very much beyond fully light by about here, which is probably what, 75, 80%, and then fully heavy again by about here. So 60 odd percent. So yeah, the biting point where I'm just feeling myself overcome those theoretical springs is about, I'm going to say it's about there. So what should we say that is? 75%, maybe 70%. It's actually quite a low biting point, more like perhaps a paddle clutch or something if I was referencing something I'd fit at work. So about 70 odd percent. Now, as I say, it would be handy if we had an actual percentage. We haven't, so shit happens. So then let's hop into Assetto Corsa. If you look down on the left-hand side here, you've actually got the same sort of bar type illustration. Again, the percentage would be way handier. And again, up to the right here, if you look, clutch, axis 3, same thing again. Now, it says range immediately below this, 0 to 100%. If you leave it at 100%, it wants you to press the pedal 100% of the way before you can change gear. So, you want to bring this pedal down to, we'll say about 70%, because I think that's roughly where it feels like I'm at or just beyond the biting point on these Fanatec pedals. Now again, if you've got the Huizenvelds or the Pro Sim or some of the other ones out there, theirs is not going to be the same place. You need to physically feel it and feel where you overcome those simulated clutch springs that I explained a little while ago, and that's where you need to set it to. There's a lot of things in sim racing are down to personal preference. This isn't down to personal preference. These pedals have a physical simulated biting point, and that is where you should set your saturation to, just beyond that, to get the most realistic setup. You know, you might say, oh, but I prefer it at 40% or 30%, I prefer it at 90%. You might do, but then what's happening in game does not reflect what you're feeling through your clutch pedal. So that's up to you if you want to do it. But if you want it to reflect what you physically have under your foot, this is how you set it up. Now, referencing linear pedals that don't have a simulated biting point like the Logitech or the Thrustmaster ones, it really then is up to you to choose where you want it to be. Now, like I said, in real life, some cars have a really high biting point. You might only travel 30% and you can disengage the clutch, go in the next gear, sorry, or pull away. Race pedals often have a much shorter travel and their biting point's really low. Now, again, you can't physically adjust the travel of your pedal because that moves as far as it moves. But you can adjust where you want your biting point to be on a linear pedal because you haven't got that physical simulated biting point. So, you know, you could make, I tend to set, excuse me, I tend to set Logitech ones about 40 to 45%. That's like an average for an average car where it might be. You know, you can go further if you want, and you can go less if you want. You can, pardon me, gassy this morning. That'll be this Dr. Pepper I'm drinking. Sorry, what was I saying? Yeah, you can almost cheat when you've got linear pedals and set the saturation to say 10%. That means you've barely got to move the pedal and you can change gear, which means you can do faster gear changes if you only depress the pedal a little bit. But I'm not suggesting you do that. It's not very realistic, and technically I would say it's almost cheating because you can't, in real life it doesn't work like that. So, I think that's probably everything. 22-minute video explaining how to set up a clutch pedal. Okay. I do like to waffle, but I hope this waffle is useful to some people. I hope the explanation of how the clutch works was useful, and then I hope you can see how that translates to how you would set the saturation in your sim of choice. Whether we're in a Assetto Corsa here, Dirt Rally, they all have a saturation setting or a range setting, and that will allow you to tune how the game behaves based on how your physical pedal behaves. I think that is everything I wanted to show you. So, as always, any questions, stick them in the comments. You know, if I've missed something, if something's not clear, just ask me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys all next Friday in another sim racing video. As always, take it easy.